In the last video, I asked ChatGPT for some exercises involving writing classes with very few constraints besides, don't use features of classes that we haven't learned yet. And it came up with some stuff that was initially sort of boring, but then ended up being really exciting and interesting because it required a bit of, like cleverness to be used as well. What I want to do now, though, because the last exercise was pretty involved, is write some, like midterm style class practice exercises. I'm not sure how best to get ChatGPT to give that to me. I'm going to try asking it something similar to what I've been asking it when I want like starter code with functions that are missing, and just hope that puts me on the right track. I want some practice with writing classes in C++ 20. Currently, all I know about classes is how to write constructors, destructors. I know about, constructors, destructors, member functions, and how access control and how access control works, I guess. I guess I know about private data and how private data and access control work. Okay, that's not quite grammatically correct, but I think it'll figure it out. Can you generate 3 programming exercises in the following format? Each exercise is missing the definition of a class, but has a formal specification for that class provided in a comment. Each exercise has starter code with a complete main function that already contains test cases for the class that I will have to write. Okay, and then let's see. I'm going to leave it there and see what it does, and then I'll refine my prompt if it turns out that it seems to generate. If it generates exercises that require more advanced features, then I'll refine my prompt. Don't show me the solution. All right. Of course, here are 3 exercises. Okay, so bank account. We'll scroll up. Okay, so it didn't generate any test cases in main. That's not great. Okay, define a class called bank account. This rings a bell. Yep, account number, account holder name, balance, public member functions, fair enough. Student record, yeah, fair enough. Rectangle. Okay, well, ChatGPT and I have a few things in common. I think I'm not going to do rectangle because, ChatGPT, you're a bit late to the party here. I'm afraid I might be an expert in writing rectangle classes. I don't need any practice with that. Let's do exercise 1. Now, the question is, how do we negotiate to get an exercise that actually does what I wanted? It didn't give me testing code. So let's see. I guess I could say just rewrite everything, but give me testing code. I want each exercise to already have testing code in main. Can you rewrite each? What I want to write is the missing class in each case, not test cases. Can you rewrite those exercises to include testing code in main, but don't include the definition of each class? Don't show me the solution, just in case I'm not being clear enough about that. Okay, we'll see what it does. Certainly, okay, so it still has this nice comment with the class thing, and then it's writing me a test case in a comment for some reason. That's sort of weird. Should I ask it to fix that? I want more than one test case per exercise, and I want the test cases to be uncommented. Like, why is it suddenly commenting out the test cases? It's never done that before. Certainly, here you go. Okay. Yeah. So there's something, I don't know, in its programming, like some switch is flipped where it suddenly thinks that I want commented out test cases. I could argue with it, but I'm beginning to wonder if that's worth my time. Yeah, it says, now you have multiple test cases for each exercise, all uncommented. I'm going to argue with it a little bit. I just can't resist. So I'm just going to point out that it's obviously lying. So you said but all of the test cases are commented. Maybe it doesn't know what uncommented means. Maybe it thinks uncommented means commented, like flammable and inflammable. Okay, here it seems to have worked. Okay, we're going to do bank account, and then we'll let it keep churning away down there. I'm sort of disappointed that it took me so long to get this out of it. Okay, I'll paste over the code that I already had. I'm going to make the editorial change as I did in the last video where I use curly brackets. There are reasons why using round brackets, getting into the habit of always running round bracket constructors can make a mess for a bunch of reasons later. One of them is due to an ambiguity that shows up with round bracket constructors. Another one is due to the need to initialize some data structures, some objects in a certain way. So for example, when you initialize a vector with a whole bunch of different elements, you can't use a round bracket constructor. But if you always use curly bracket constructors, you're not going to need to worry about that distinction. It'll always work. Okay, so I've got two test cases. I need to write a class called bank account. I can do that. I've written classes about bank accounts before in other videos, so I mean, this is, I guess, if nothing else, good review. So class bank account. I'm going to try and implement it based only on the description here and maybe see whether I end up needing to adjust my expectations based on what the test cases are doing. Because although it was a bit of a struggle to get those test cases, I think ChatGPT generally can generate test cases that make some amount of sense, even if they're not perfectly thorough. Okay, so I want a constructor that takes, I'm going to just add some white space here. I want a constructor that takes an account number and account holder's name and initializes the balance to 0. I guess first it's naming the members for me. It wants them to have these names. It's included string.h, so I can just go ahead and add those members, which I'm going to do. Private, okay, so string account number, string account holder name, and then string, let's see, oh, that's not a string, that's a double balance. Here is another occasion for me to point out that in the so-called real world, you should never, ever, 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 ever use a floating point type if you are doing something like tracking the balance of a bank account. Using a floating point type to track the price of a product that you're selling is probably not a big deal, but if you are storing currency values that need to change over time, especially due to small transactions, so adding money, removing money, or earning interest, then you should not use a floating point type, because the inherent inaccuracy of floating point types, the fact they only have a certain amount of precision, and that rounding errors can occur, means that currency transactions can be rendered unreliable with floating point types. So do not do that. Instead, you should be using fixed point arithmetic, whatever that is. If for some reason you get a co-op at a bank and they set you loose on day one writing production code to manipulate customers' account balances, which is frankly not very likely. But just in case, I don't want people getting the idea that I'm encouraging people to use doubles to store account balances. But in this exercise, it should be just fine. And it's ChatGPT's fault because it said I should use a double. Okay, I want a constructor that takes an account number. So I'm going to I'll just use my naming convention for these. Account number, oh wait, account number is an integer. What am I doing? Okay, int account number. Int takes an account number. It takes an account holder's name. We'll just call that name for the sake of the argument. And then the constructor automatically initializes the balance to 0. My assumption being that I guess we're not taking the customer's word for it for what their balance is. So I initialize my account number to be the account number that I was provided. I initialize the account holder name to be name. And then I initialize balance to be 0. Is that going to fit on the line? No. Okay, so I'll just move this to the next line. And then the constructor's body is just empty. All right, I'm going to do 0.0 for this to make it obvious to readers that this is a double. Okay, so that's my constructor. I'm going to try writing the other functions. This is if I have a compiler, I really ought to try testing as I go. The problem is, if I want to test this, I either have to comment out the code in main, which tries to call the functions that I haven't written yet, which means looking at the code in main, or I've got to write all the functions and leave them empty or something. This maybe trying to write it all at once without compiling is a risk, but maybe it's a good way to get some practice, build some confidence so that when I have to write a class on a midterm or something, that I'm able to do so in one pass. Okay, so a function called deposit that takes a double amount and adds it to the balance. Okay, so I'll call this, I guess it's void deposit double amount. Now, in the video, so one of the lecture videos actually is for a bank account, I think, or for a credit card or something. And it's the video about throwing, well, among other things, throwing exceptions to allow the class to control the way that its data is manipulated. So I'm going to basically do the same thing here. I'm going to throw an exception. I'm going to, unlike in the last video, I'm just going to bring in the standard exceptions and use those. All right, so here I'm going to try to, if you try and deposit a negative amount, then I'm going to have a problem because that seems like a withdrawal in disguise, and it seems like you're trying to I don't know, like exploit the system somehow. You're trying to exploit some loophole. So if amount is less, not negative 10, if amount is less than 0, then you're trying to deposit a negative amount, and that doesn't make any sense to me, so I'm going to throw invalid argument. Cannot be negative. Okay, and then otherwise, I'm going to add to my balance, so I'll say balance plus equals amount. I imagine that the withdrawal function is pretty much the same deal, except for a subtraction instead of addition. So again, with withdrawal, if I let the customer withdraw a negative amount, they're making a deposit in disguise. So I'm going to do the same thing. Withdrawals cannot be negative, and then balance minus equals amount. But I also want to consider the case where the amount that they are withdrawing is too large, and I don't think I'm going to allow that. So if it doesn't say what to do in this case, I suppose I could ask it for a clarification. But I'm going to say if amount is greater than balance, then we also have a problem. The account is overdrawn. And then I'll just not do the withdrawal. So it's the customer's decision what they do about this situation, but we're not going to allow them to go into the negative. I need get balance and get account holder name. So those seem pretty straightforward. So get balance would be return double, get balance, and it's just going to return the balance. And then double, string. Then I return the account holder name. Okay, now as an experiment, I'm going to see what happens if I just compile this. I haven't looked at the testing code in main beyond a glance. I'm going to see whether it'll compile just exactly as I've written it, and it looks like it has. So I've used the right function names, and so the code now has everything it's supposed to need. So here's John Doe, and I deposit $1,000, withdraw 500. I should then have a balance of 500 by my reckoning. Here I deposit 1,500 and withdraw 800, so I should have 700 left. And I do. All right. These are the two test cases that ChatGPT gave me. And so I'm going to just leave it there. I'm going to claim that the exercise is now done. Now, I was the one that added the extra tests for invalid deposits and withdrawals. So I wouldn't expect ChatGPT to catch that and add test cases for that. Because I recorded a different video where I talk about basically this exact problem, I'm just going to leave it there because I want to have some time to go on to at least one of the other exercises. Okay, so there's the bank account one. The next one is student records. Okay, so I don't want to look at the testing code, but I'm going to pick one of the remaining two exercises based on whichever one is the most interesting. I think it'll be the student one, but who knows. Then I've got this one about rectangles, and I can't see a situation where the rectangle one would be something I have not already done, because I definitely have spent a lot of time on rectangles in this course. Yeah, exercise 3 looks like something we've already done, so we will do exercise 2. So I'll head over here, I'll paste it in. I'm going to also sort of ignore the testing code for the time being. And I'm going to create a class called student. So class student. And they are going to contain, so I'll make my public and private sections. They're going to contain 3 members. So student ID is an integer. There it is. String student name. And then finally, double GPA. And I'm going to use uppercase because it uses uppercase when giving me the name. And then I want, this is actually a less exciting exercise than the one we just did. Then I want a constructor that takes a student ID and student name and GPA. So it's initializing everything. I rather liked the bank account constructor, where one of the members was initialized to 0, not to one of the parameters. So, okay, int ID, string name, and double I'll just do lowercase GPA, and then I initialize my student ID member to be ID. I initialize my student name member to be name, and I initialize my GPA to be the GPA that was provided. I keep reflexively typing GPT instead of GPA, so that's a sign of where my mind has been going these days. And then I do nothing in the constructor because all I was doing was initialize. I need a function called update GPA, so I'm going to say void update GPA that takes a new GPA and update GPT. And so there'll be new GPA and updates the GPA member variable. Now here, unlike the bank account example, I really want this exercise to be more complicated. I want there to be some twist to it. So I think I'm going to do it the way it's written and then come back at the end and ask ChatGPT to make it more complicated for me. So I'm going to set GPA to equal new GPA. What I'm thinking of is maybe asking ChatGPT to require that I add a constraint to this so that GPAs cannot be negative. Okay, and then get student info, which displays the student's ID, name, and GPA. I guess that's a void, so get student info, and it takes no arguments, and I just print them out. So I'll print out name, student name, here we go, and then I'll just copy and paste it. So there's their ID. I guess it says print the ID first, and then it is their GPA. All right, I'm going to try compiling this as written, and it looks like it, well, no, that's the wrong compile command, so I shouldn't get my hopes up too soon. There we go. Okay, it looks like it did compile. I'll try running it, and the two students are going to be presumably Alice and Bob, real original. So, but it looks like they're printing correctly. That looks good. I don't know that there's much more for me to do here. I mean, it looks like it's able to print the GPA. I trust that update GPA is working. I don't think I need detailed tests for that in this context. Let's ask ChatGPT to make that exercise more complicated. I really enjoyed exercise 1 and exercise 2. I found exercise 2 a bit too easy, a bit too basic. Can you regenerate exercise 2 to add some extra complexity? For example, maybe there should be some constraint against a GPA being negative. So ChatGPT's never met engineering students, so it probably doesn't know that GPAs can be, it probably assumes GPAs can't be negative. Okay, so it looks like it just took my suggestion. It didn't, I was hoping it would add some other interesting things, but it looks like it just took my suggestion. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, that looks good, but I want even more complexity. I mean, just see what it comes up with. Oh, okay, yep, nope, I'm asking for it now. Okay, so we'll copy this, and I'm going to try and, I've tried to phrase my question in a way that would allow me to not rewrite the whole thing, but instead just update the exercise a bit. So like I can still use the, oh, it didn't copy properly. I can still use the code I'd already written and just add extra stuff to it to avoid rewriting it all from scratch. Was it not done or something? I'll hit copy code again, and then we'll try pasting it again. I've had a lot of issues with copying and pasting lately. Okay, so there we go. I'll get rid of the old main, the original main with the original test case. I'm now noticing I had that problem with it not generating test cases earlier or having an issue. I think maybe the issue is just that I was asking for 3 exercises at once. It might be that it can only generate a certain amount of stuff at a time, and if I ask for 1 exercise, it'll do a better job. I'm going to take the specification of my student class and bring it up. So copy that, bring it up here. And then we'll revise what we already wrote to have this new specification. Okay, so now student has 5 private members. I assume, yeah, okay, so the first 3 are the ones I already had. Now I've got a vector of course names and a vector of grades. That's a good idea. So let's do that. So we'll say vector of string. I think the course names will be strings. Course, I'm going to use my own. Does it give me a name to use? No. So it says courses. Okay. So courses, there we go. And then we'll do not names, grades. I guess the grades can be, the grades can be ints until I receive any information to the contrary. We'll maybe scroll down and take a peek here. Add course grade. It seems to want the course grade to be like on a 4-point scale like is common in American universities. So I guess that means we're going to be doing a double. Okay, so double, and then this is going to be grades. All right. I assume that those just get initialized to be empty. The constructor is now different. The constructor takes an ID, a name, and initializes the GPA to 0. All right. So we'll do GPA. Oh, I can keep it as an initializer. GPA gets initialized to 0.0. I've got a function called add course grade, and it adds a course. It takes a course name and a grade, and those are the grade's a double value. It adds the course and grade to the respective vectors, and then update the GPA based on the newly added course and grade. I like this because it's going to give me something to comment on in a minute. It looks like this is going to get rid of that issue that I had in the last example where I was saying if you want to update the GPA, what if it's negative? Because it seems like now there is no update GPA function anymore. So I'm just going to delete that. And so I'm going to add course grade. So void add course grade. And it's going to take the course and not a string, but double grade. The way it's phrased right now is it just says add the course to the list of courses, add the grade to the list of grades. The idea being at any given point, I assume that index 3 of the course vector corresponds to index 3 of the grade vector. So you just make sure the vectors grow in parallel. So I'll do courses dot push back course, and I'll do grades dot push back grade. So here, I'm wondering whether there is a certain bit of error checking I might want to do, which is what if they already took this course? Like, do I care if the course is in there twice? It doesn't say that I should, so I'm not going to worry about it. But if I'm still have some patience when this exercise is over, I might go ask it for more clarification. It then says, ensure that the grade is within the valid range. And that's 0 to 4. Okay. If not, throw an exception. It doesn't say what exception to throw, so I guess I'll pick whatever I want. This is weird because it's listed as the third bullet point. Like, it's almost saying like I should add the stuff and then throw the exception. In my mind, I should first check if it's valid, and I shouldn't add anything if I throw the exception. This warrants a clarification. In the specification for the add course grade function, that's what it's called, yes. Checking for a valid grade is listed third in the set of steps. Does this mean I should add the grade and update the GPA before throwing an exception? And I'm expecting, if it understands what I mean, it should say no, because that's weird. Yes. What? Oh, it's showing me the answer. Okay, well, there's the answer. I mean, it didn't do part of it for me, but it actually does. It was going to suggest invalid argument. That's a good suggestion. It actually does want me to add the course and grade and then throw an exception. In other words, I let the invalid data get into the data structure. I'll do it, but I'm not going to like it. Okay, so I've done pushback of course and grade. I now have to recompute GPA. So this is interesting. This will be the last exercise I do in this video, because I'm going to have a bunch of stuff to say about the design that ChatGPT has required me to use. This is actually a good exercise for practice, but this is also a good case study in bad class design. So this is a poorly designed class. The abstraction is sort of there, but everything else happening behind the scenes is nonsensical in my mind. Okay, so now I'm going to say if grade is less than 0 or grade is greater than 4, I guess I'll do those as point zeros. Well, then we've got ourselves a problem. We've got an invalid grade. And for some reason, ChatGPT thinks I should check this after already using the grade value. So I throw, I think invalid argument was a good choice. I'm going to say that grade is invalid. All right, so now how do I recompute the GPA? Well, basically what I'm going to do is just set the GPA to equal, well, okay, first I'm going to, I guess, add up all the grades and average them. So I'll do double sum. It starts at 0 for auto G in grades. Sum plus equals G. Now, this is the kind of thing that maybe would be better done with a private member function. So then I set GPA to be equal to sum divided by grades dot size. I don't have to deal with the case where there's 0 grades, because I know I just pushed something into the grades array, so there has to be at least one thing, so I'm not doing a division by 0 here. This can just go in the add course grade function, so I'll leave it there for now. I think I'm going to modify it in a minute to add a private member function, just to try and get some other educational outcomes out of this exercise. Now, there's a couple of other bits of housekeeping I want to do. So in the testing code, it doesn't use invalid argument because it just says throw some exception in the specification. It doesn't say what exception I'm supposed to throw. But I've chosen invalid argument. Now, in main, it's doing something peculiar, something we're going to learn about shortly, but we haven't learned about yet. It has a catch block for std exception, which of course is not the same as std invalid argument. I'm going to run this code the way that it's written. And we can see here I've got a bunch of problems already. So what is it complaining about? It's saying that it can't construct, that I have this student and I've taken... Oh, right. So in the new exercise, it told me to have the constructor just take the ID and the name because there's no longer the facility to modify the GPA from outside. So I forgot to update the constructor for that, and that's why it's complaining. So I'm going to compile this again. I am going to modify these constructor calls to be curly brackets before I forget. So I would prefer that. I would rather use uniform initialization. So I have that. And then I want to actually modify this, but I'm going to show off that it does work. Practice classes 3. So we can see here we're able to create Alice. We add the grade for math. We add the grade for English. There's no, I guess get student info might need to be modified. But notice how when I create Bob, I try and give Bob an invalid grade, 4.5. And ChatGPT correctly points out that this should throw an exception and that this line here, 84, should never be reached, which is true. But notice how this catch block caught invalid argument, which is weird because we haven't yet seen exactly how that works. This isn't the same type as invalid argument. Why can the catch block still work? The answer is due to something called polymorphism, which we haven't talked about yet. I think that's week 8. So I'm going to actually catch invalid argument explicitly in both of these cases. I'm also going to go up and look at the get student info specification because I keep talking, I'm not actually focusing very well on this, and I've noticed that it does want me to modify get student info to display the GPA and a list of courses. So I should do that. Okay, there's get student info. I'm going to list the courses and grades in one line. So I'm just going to list courses with their grades. So here are the courses. And then I want to loop over both courses and grades in tandem. So I guess I'm going to use an indexing loop. Unsigned int I starts at 0, I is less than courses.size. It's an implicit assumption here that courses and grades have the same size because the only place I modify them is in add course grade where they're both modified at the same time and in the same way. So I can assume that index I should work for both at any given time. Courses.size and grades.size should be equal. So I'll print to see out courses.addI. And then I'll also print a space, and then I'll say grade, and then I'll just print the grade, grades.addI, and then I'll print out a closing bracket and a space, and then at the end of all this, I'll print out a new line. Here we go. We'll try that. All right, so we've got Alice, took math with grade 3.75, also took English with grade 4. I might want to manipulate this to give me decimal places. Okay, I think I'm done the exercise. I've implemented the specifications. So that's the end of the exercise and the end of the video as far as writing code is concerned. I now have a bunch of stuff to say about this exercise. So the idea of an exercise to represent student records is great. I mean, it's already fed me a whole bunch of those over the past few videos, and I did that in my 111 exercises as well. However, this design is terrible. The original student exercise, the one I did in the first half, so before I asked it to make it more complicated, was all right. I mean, maybe I should have added to the update GPA function an exception, have it throw an exception if the GPA was negative, but that isn't inherently a design flaw because that's a question of how we specify the exercise. This, however, the revised exercise is poorly designed for a bunch of reasons. Okay, so the first one, obviously, because we saw this one coming, when I find that there's an invalid grade, ChatGPT has insisted that I throw an exception here at the end of the function. And that's weird, because if the grade is invalid, then I should catch it up here at the beginning of the function and say, sorry, you can't use that grade, we're done. I'm not going to let invalid data get seep into the data inside my object. That's the whole point of this access control. You call add course grade to add the grade instead of adding the grade yourself to the vectors, because you're not allowed to access the vectors because I'm the gatekeeper. I'm just doing a really bad job of being gatekeeper here. I'm adding an invalid grade, recomputing my GPA based on the invalid grade, and then saying, oh yeah, by the way, that grade was bad. I'm going to remember it and use it in the future, but that grade was bad. That's terrible. This is a terrible design. It's really bizarre that ChatGPT stuck with it. Usually when I ask ChatGPT a question like this, saying, do you actually want me to throw the exception at the end? Usually it takes the hint and it's like, no, it's fine. Throw it at the beginning. Usually when you ask a question like that, it's a pushover. It just falls right down. Here, it decided to dig in, and this was the worst possible time to do that. Some of the questions I ask, I actually don't mind which response it gives. Here, I really was surprised that it doubled down. So this is bad design. This is a completely stupid a stupid design for add course grade. I could say in my opinion, but I'd like to believe I know a thing or two about how we should store students and grades. I mean, ultimately, I can't see any situation where this is going to result in code that works better than if we had it up here. And I can see situations where this would make things worse. The worst one is if I call this function with an invalid grade, the invalid grade ends up stuck inside the grades array forever because there's no facility to remove grades in this exercise. Okay, that's one issue, a big one. This is a badly designed class for that reason. There's a second one, though. This is less of a major foul, but still something that I think we should avoid. The issue here is that GPA is being stored as a data member. So I'm storing the GPA at all times. However, the GPA fundamentally is a function of the list of grades. So if I modify the list of grades, the GPA will change. And if I modify the GPA, that would imply the grades list has changed, but it doesn't make sense if I modify the GPA to know what I'm supposed to do to my list of grades. So arguably, the GPA is derived exclusively from this member here, which means, in my opinion, if we're supposed to compute the GPA, or we're supposed to have the GPA, it should be computed every time we need it using a function. So I might write something like this, get GPA. And in my mind, the class should probably be written more like this. I shouldn't have a data member for GPA, and instead, every time I want the GPA, I should just go and compute it on the fly using my grades array. Because that way there is no chance that I end up with the GPA and the grades array being out of sync. Because if I have GPA be a data member, so this is what I would prefer to have. If you want the GPA, you call this function, it computes the GPA on the fly. If I have the GPA as a data member, so if I go back to what I had a minute ago here, I'm undoing a bit too much stuff. If I go back to what I had a minute ago where the GPA is a data member, then we run the risk of me at one point modifying the grades array and forgetting to update GPA. So the two values go out of sync. And that means that they're sort of useless, because if they're out of sync, we don't necessarily know easily from the outside which one of them is wrong. We have to treat them both as being wrong. So I would rather have the GPA, because it's a derived quantity, not be stored explicitly. Now there are cases in practice where you have to do this, because maybe computing the GPA is so complicated that you can't afford to compute it from scratch every time you need it. In that case, yes, you do have to save it inside the class, and yes, you do have to take the risk that it might get out of sync. But in general, until you reach that point, I don't think this is necessary. So that's also, in my opinion, a sort of bad design. Now, we could also maybe think that the reason that bad design occurred was because I told ChatGPT to update an exercise that already existed that contained GPA as a member, and of course, in that case, maybe it just left it in. Maybe that's the most charitable interpretation I can come up with. Okay, and then finally, this is not so much a design thing, but just one last little note. Here in this example, what I've highlighted here is the calculation for the GPA. I've done the calculation from scratch inside the add course grade function, because in this exercise, that's the only place I need to compute the GPA. But arguably, I might need to update the GPA in lots of different cases. If I ever need to recompute the GPA, so when I add a grade, or if I were ever to remove a grade or something, I don't want to have to copy and paste this calculation in multiple places in my code. So instead, if I find that I want GPA to be a data member, and I often need to recompute it, it's probably better to make recompute GPA a private member function. So inside the class, whenever I want to recompute the GPA, I call this function, and then it recomputes the GPA. The outside world knows nothing of this function because it's private. So as far as the outside world is concerned, my code is no different now than it was a minute ago, but I have a bit more flexibility and a little bit more security that I'm not going to mess up one of the GPA computations, because every time I recompute the GPA, I call the same function. Either that function has a bug or it doesn't. If I copy and paste the GPA computation into multiple places, there is a chance that one of those places ends up with a bug, and that's going to be a debugging nightmare, and in general, that creates a maintainability hazard. So this is something I would do, although what I had before isn't inherently a bad design thing. It's just a sort of a pragmatic compromise. Okay, so this was also an interesting exercise for reasons that I wasn't expecting. In the last video, we had this happen where it gave me what appeared to be a boring exercise that turned out to be pretty interesting, to have some hidden dimensions. And the same thing has happened here. It's given us an exercise that wasn't so much a code writing experience as it was a good excuse to talk a little bit about design. And I sort of like that.